Kennedy School. I'd like to welcome all of you here. We're here this evening to recognize, as is stated so succinctly in the brochure describing this award, quote, the need for corporations to accept social commitments as a part of corporate responsibility. Or as H.S.M. Burns, president of Shell Oil, once said, quote, a good manager is one who isn't worried about his own career, but is worried about the careers of those who work for him, close quote. Our speakers are distinguished by the fact that as business leaders, they have neither blamed workers for the difficult conditions of the workers' lives, nor have they blamed the government. They've just gone about the business of improving the lives of those who work for the firms they manage. This award for corporate public initiative, administered by the Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School, is named after George Dively, a graduate of Harvard Business School who built the Harris Corporation from a small builder of printing presses to an international high-technology producer of advanced communications and information systems. He provided leadership for the economic development of Ohio and has been active in the long-term development of central Cleveland. Our first speaker this evening is Russell W. Meyer, Jr., Chairman and CEO of Cessna Aircraft Company. In that position, he is also Executive Vice President of General Dynamics. Mr. Meyer is former President and CEO of Grumman American Aviation Corporation. He's here today because at Cessna, he developed a program for training the hardcore unemployed. You may have seen a wonderful feature, television feature on this Cessna program recently on NBC News. The principles of that program are simple and clear. Train people at their own rate, address personal needs such as child care and transportation, provide compensation and benefits while training, and guarantee a job at the end of the process. The second speaker is Arnold Hyatt, Chairman of the Board of the StrideRight Corporation here in Cambridge. Mr. Hyatt is a former member of the Harvard Board of Overseers and a present member of the Advisory Board for the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy here at the Kennedy School. Arnold Hyatt is here because of the reputation StrideRight has developed for its social service projects, particularly for pioneering on-site child care. He started the first center in 1971, and the program has been growing ever since. Last February, StrideRight opened its Intergenerational Center, where children and elderly people, dependents of workers, have special programs and activities and interact with one another. Again, if you take a look at the brochure, you will see that Mr. Hyatt modeled his idea on the notion of extended family. As he said, quote, we have a chance to relate in a way that is as old as the family of man, close quote. We'll hear from our speakers in order, and then we'll turn to questions and answers. So first, our first speaker, Russell Meyer.
Thank you very much, Dean. I must say that it's awfully nice to be back at Harvard after an interim of something like 30 years. And while it would be inaccurate to say that there have been no changes during that period of time, it's reassuring to see so many familiar scenes and sights around Cambridge. And that feeling of permanence at a university which is a source of such dynamic education reflects very clearly the greatness of this institution. It's a special privilege for me to receive an award which was established in memory of George Dively, a man whose reputation for community service was already well known when Helen and I drove our U-Haul from Cambridge to Cleveland in 1961 after graduating from Harvard Law School. One of my college roommates worked for George Dively for several years as Director of Long-Range Planning, an experience he still describes as a highlight of his career. So knowing from personal experience of Mr. Dively's commitment to serve his community and this university in so many ways, I'm especially proud to receive an award which bears his name. and I accept that award on behalf of some dedicated and deserving people at Cessna, and I'd like to briefly share with you their achievements in earning this great honor. As I hope you know, Cessna Aircraft Company has a long history in aviation. The company was founded in Wichita, Kansas by Clyde Cessna in 1927, and during our 64 years in operation, we've manufactured and delivered about 180,000 aircraft, which is far more than any other manufacturer. A high percentage of those aircraft are still in operation, so if you look up in the sky one of these days and see two airplanes flying practically anywhere in the world, chances are awfully good that at least one of them is a Cessna. Because the staggering increase in the cost of product liability has essentially destroyed the light aircraft industry in our country, we've concentrated our resources at Cessna on the business jet segment of the market, and we've been fortunate to achieve a position of industry leadership in that area. Although we were able to respond effectively to a rather dramatic change in the industry, it was not without considerable pain, the most serious of which was the dislocation of thousands of our employees. And it was not without the kind of effort and dedication that is always essential to the success of any endeavor. But thanks to an almost heroic effort by our employees, Cessna began to grow again in 1986, and the past 5 years have been some of our best ever. During that period of time, we've watched with increasing concern an economic and social issue which, in my view, represents the most serious threat to the long-term vitality and well-being of our community, in fact, of our country, since the democratic form of government was created more than 200 years ago. I would describe this issue as the widening and sharply defined gap between those of us who are fortunate enough to have an education, to have a job, and to provide adequately for our children, and those who have none of these advantages. In Wichita, for example, we have literally thousands of men and women, a disproportionate percentage of whom are minorities, who have literally no chance of securing steady employment, and who in the best of times can barely support themselves, much less anyone else. When we began an aggressive hiring program at Cessna a few years ago, we were shocked to discover the unusually low percentage of qualified applicants. During a 2-year period when we hired about 1,200 new employees, we interviewed more than 14,000 candidates. We found that a substantial number of people between the ages of 18 and 45 do not have adequate reading or math or language skills to even qualify for one of our basic training programs. These are the individuals for whom the welfare system was created. But while welfare may help to prevent starvation, these people have essentially no chance of leading productive lives or of gaining the pride and self-esteem derived from supporting themselves and supporting a family. We decided to try to do something about this issue in Wichita. Our objective was to provide the training, the guidance, the support, and the patience to enable an individual considered unemployable to develop the basic skills, the confidence, and the discipline to acquire meaningful employment. We frankly had very little idea what would be required to achieve this goal, but we were committed to succeed, and we found an abundance of excellent help in evaluating the process. We began by meeting with companies like Hallmark, Polaroid, Digital Equipment, and IBM, all of whom had considerable experience in creating special programs for the disadvantaged, and who were genuinely interested in sharing everything they'd learned. We also found eager partners in our city and county governments in Wichita, since they recognized, perhaps more than we did, the urgency of involving the private sector in this critically important rehabilitation program. When we decided to acquire a deserted supermarket in the heart of the highest crime rate and largely minority neighborhood in northeast Wichita and transform that building into a modern training and manufacturing facility, both branches of government responded to our requirements, and they performed as promised. Less than 1 year after our initial announcement, we opened Cessna's 21st Street facility, representing what we hope will be the start of a crusade in Wichita and perhaps throughout the entire country. We opened the facility in December of 1990, and our first class was composed of 15 women who had been selected with the assistance of various social agencies from a pool of 450 applicants. All of these ladies were on welfare. Most were minorities. None had been employed in other than temporary, meaningful jobs. Most were single parents, and the group had a total of 38 children to support. Statistics aside, I was impressed by the common denominator which was reflected in their attitude and their comments on the first morning that they came to class. They were grateful for the opportunity. They were determined and eager to learn. They wanted to work, and they wanted independence from the welfare system. We're awfully proud of that first class. All graduated, and each of them moved at their own pace from the assembly operation in their neighborhood to a full-time job at one of our major facilities. Everyone in that class has received a general equivalency degree, and several are continuing to take additional courses in their spare time. It's not a perfect process yet. We lost one woman to drugs, and one has left work because of some family problems that she felt incapable of resolving. We hope she'll return. Our second class of 19 began in the spring. It was made up of 11 men and 8 women, and all completed the program. We recently graduated another class of 11, and we're just beginning another new class of trainees this week. This program is working for a number of reasons. It's working because it's not an inflexible training curriculum. Although we have an official starting and graduation date, the transition from 21st Street to one of our manufacturing facilities is a joint decision between us and the trainee, who must have the courage and confidence to make this major and sometimes traumatic move. It's working because we try to provide support to each trainee in other aspects of his life or her life. We deal routinely with domestic issues, with transportation and housing problems, with stress, eviction, utility shutoffs, child care, severe indebtedness, birth control, personal hygiene, drug usage, pregnancies, court appearances, and lack of self-confidence. We're working with people who have never had a bank account, who rarely had minimum wage, who have an incredible variety of family problems, and whose primary source of support has been welfare. We generate great excitement among these trainees when we give them a Cessna employee badge the day they arrive at 21st Street. The badge has their picture. It gives them an identity, a sense of belonging, and by the way, it also gives them the ability to cash a check at a local bank. They gain confidence in themselves from little victories, and we provide them as often as possible. We display samples of their work. We praise good effort at every opportunity. The first paycheck is a ceremony that we hold which causes enormous celebration. And of course, the presentation of a graduation certificate is the ultimate prize. It's working because we have mentors at Cessna who volunteer to assist each trainee in learning the ropes, meeting other employees, and feeling comfortable in both their jobs and in this new environment. And finally, this program is working because more than anything else, this is an exercise in caring. And the people who care the most are the Cessna employees who volunteered to participate. They've done a fantastic job, and I'm delighted that some of them are here today to share in the Dively Award. I'd like to introduce them to you. First, I'd like to introduce John Moore. John, would you just stand for a second? Whose extensive responsibilities include community relation, and John takes that responsibility very seriously. He provided the leadership to locate the site, build the facility, initiate a valuable dialogue with the other companies, and coordinate the selection and training process. Johnny Cartledge, the very first Cessna employee. Johnny was the very first Cessna employee to volunteer for this program. He's the manager of our 21st Street facility. We could not have found a better man for the job. John has been a teacher in an inner-city school, a manufacturing engineer, a supervisor, and believe me, he is sensitive to the requirement of teaching our trainees more than just the vocational skills. And finally, Teresa Clark. Teresa, our counselor. To describe Teresa as a counselor is one of the great understatements, and her title includes an almost infinite number of challenges every day. I couldn't begin to list the ways in which she provides support, and I'll tell you that with great affection, the trainees have begun to call her Mother Teresa, a name extremely well earned because very few graduates would succeed without her continuing counsel and her support. In conclusion, I must admit to you that it's terribly frustrating to recognize that this country has millions of people who are really desperate for the opportunity to be productive citizens and who are aching to experience the pride and self-esteem of supporting themselves and their families. It's also frustrating to realize that this enormous problem cannot be solved quickly or easily, and it certainly cannot be solved by the government. But we believe it can be solved. It can be solved by a massive nationwide effort in which thousands of companies agree to participate. Depending upon the size of the company, that participation may be limited to just a few employees a year, but even small numbers can make a huge impact with a large multiplier. In that respect, we're about to make an exciting announcement at Cessna. We've offered other companies in the Wichita area that we will expand the number of trainees and pay for all the training if they will simply guarantee a specific number of jobs and then provide the support the trainees need following graduation. So on the first anniversary of our So on the first anniversary of our 21st Street facility, on December 3rd, a few weeks from now, we will announce that at least 2 other companies will make this commitment, enabling us to double the number of trainees next year, and we hope that many more companies will follow their lead and also agree to participate. And the city has just announced a kind of a nice surprise, too. After years of delay, it will undertake a major highway improvement and beautification program covering 1.5 miles on 21st Street, a project that begins right in front of our facility. We may not have a crusade yet, but we're gaining momentum, and within 2 years of our first class, we will have trained and placed almost 200 employees, all of whom will truly experience the joy of self-reliance. If we could somehow convince 10,000 companies in this kind of caring crusade, we would create a whole new world for 2 million people in just 2 years, and that would make a difference. We've been very fortunate at Cessna and very proud to receive many awards over the years, but I can assure you that this award for our 21st Street project is the most significant and the most cherished of them all. It's a tremendous privilege to accept the Dively Award on behalf of so many people at Cessna and in the Wichita community who've been involved in this program. But most important, I accept for all the graduates and the trainees who are well aware of and excited about this ceremony today. This is not just a little victory for them, it's a world championship. And you can be absolutely certain that the Dively Award will be proudly displayed in our 21st Street facility first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
And now we hear from Arnold Hyatt.
I like buying products from companies like yours, Russ. And if our treasurer weren't here tonight, I'd put an order in for a plane. I too share your feeling of award on behalf of the StrideRight Corporation and some of my colleagues who are here this evening to make sure I don't I sometimes find it remarkable that this intergenerational center is hailed as original and the first in the nation. It reminds me of the summer my mother left me with our grandparents. And I realized, in retrospect, I was in an intergenerational center, and the same kind of interaction was taking place then. But lots of children today don't have that privilege. Doing the obvious and keeping things simple has really been a kind of a credo. It's StrideRight, both in the way we do business and in our social involvements in the community. And if you think about what works in our industry or any industry, it's clear that you can't succeed unless you address some very fundamental needs or some desires. And it's that same principle that applies to social involvement. Over the years, StrideRight has gained a reputation for social innovation. In 1971, we opened the first corporate daycare center in our Roxbury facility. In 1985, we instituted the first corporate clean air policy in this country. In 1989, it was time to go further with daycare and to include senior citizens in our Cambridge facility, which then became our intergenerational center. In each of these instances, we weren't setting out to be pioneers. We were trying to do the obvious. And we weren't even trying to win awards. We were simply responding to what we saw and heard all around us. For example, I could look out the window before they became opaque because of violence in the streets in Roxbury and see small preschool children at risk. And as a result, the center became available to community children, and today it has 50 or 51 of its 55 children from the community. The government had been telling us for years that smoking was unhealthy, so we did what was then apparent. In the last couple of years, we kept reading more and more about the growing problems of older citizens and their sons, and especially their daughters. And I saw the burdens, and others saw the burdens on our employees. But these investments have had a large return for hundreds of people, as well as for the company. They have contributed to a workplace that attracts good people and retains them, thereby reducing turnover. And the savings on training new employees through retention is often greater than the cost of the program itself. Money Magazine and other publications like Working Women have always rated StrideRight as one of the best companies in America to work for. Well, how do you put a value on morale or high productivity? When people feel good about a company that cares for them, they're more inclined to do a better job. So I believe that these investments that we've made have even strengthened our financial performance. And instead of being a diversion, it's really been a wind at our back. The fact is, StrideRight has increased its earnings I hope there are no security analysts here. In 19 of the last 20 years, its return on investment is in the upper 1% of all public companies. And the stockholders whose investment in StrideRight, if they had invested in StrideRight in 1985, that investment would have increased tenfold. So they haven't taken issue yet with any of our social initiatives. Ironically, it's not responding and not listening to the market and what's out there that has led so many companies in this country during the past 15 years into some trouble. The Marlboro Man, as CEO, strong, silent, decisive, and isolated. That was the ruling model in too many of our blue chip companies. And it was also matched by a definition of business responsibility and activity that was equally narrow and constrained. Business paid attention to the bottom line, period. Well, that's fine if you can always get it right. If what you see from on high is always clear and understood. But who can be right all of the time? Detroit certainly wasn't in the 70s and 80s when the Japanese listened and heard consumers ask for smaller cars that were fuel efficient. So I've learned that listening comes, at least in our business, before everything else. And in the course of listening, I've learned two other lessons as well. The first is corporate leaders have infinitely more power to affect and influence the world around them than they begin to know. In our case, we launched a public service program designed to provide financial assistance to some inner city students at Harvard. There are over 40 of them. All we do is we require them to return to the inner city from whence they come and which they know so well. These StrideRight scholars, they don't get handouts. They work hard with younger children, and they serve as role models where there are so few role models, demonstrating to these kids that there is a world beyond their prison of violence and poverty and drugs. Interestingly enough, the beneficiaries turned out not to be just the children, but the students who develop a sense of empowerment. They know that they can help others. And that self-empowerment or enabling process leads to more self-esteem on their part. Sometimes the exercise of power that executives have, if they recognize it, is purely personal. It was for me, and it happened during a business trip to South Korea. Kim Dae-jung was leader of the opposition to the military dictatorship then in power in South Korea. He had been sentenced to death as a result of some student riots in Gwangju. While I was there, I visited the American Embassy, only to be reassured by our State Department that the internal affairs of Korea were of no interest to them, and certainly shouldn't be to me, and that in fact the business community appreciated the stability that the military junta provided. I then went to see the Korean Minister of Commerce and explained that as president of a company that was importing millions of pairs of shoes from South Korea, and at the time I was also chairman of the Footwear Industries of America, I was concerned that the marketability of products that said made in Korea would not necessarily be acceptable to consumers in America who might not understand the need to put political prisoners to death. That statement didn't win me great applause. But on my return to America, I received an invitation to Washington by the Korean ambassador to the United States, who was a friend of Mr. Park, and he invited me to serve as a marketing consultant to the Korean government. 3 months later, Kim Dae-jung's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. My voice merely enhanced a chorus of protests that were coming from this country, and ultimately Kim became the opposition and principal candidate in the forthcoming presidential elections. His rise to power is a reminder of the leverage that any corporate executive can have if he or she chooses to act upon it. Just look at how other companies made a difference in South Africa once they decided to boycott en masse. More often, though, influence comes through a company's ability to set an example. Since we were the first public company to establish a clean air policy, the ensuing publicity led many other companies to follow suit. Our child care centers have been replicated by many companies and municipalities and hospitals. And now we're encouraging other companies to follow our intergenerational center. Maybe we can do a deal with Cessna tonight. We like imitation. The point is, business can affect social change. In fact, business people can no longer afford to insulate themselves and their thinking from the problems of the world in which we compete and we live. The consequences of that insulation is all around us. 1 in 5 children in the United States lives below the poverty line. And these children are the workforce of tomorrow that Russ and I are going to have to use in our successes to compete in a global marketplace. I'm talking about 13 million children in this country, along with 21 million other Americans. Well, this condition is deplorable, not just in human terms, but in economic terms as well. Further, it deprives us of a market. That market is larger than all of Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. We fight hard to get into markets like that, and there's a market in this country. But it's clear that business can't do it alone. We can't transform society single-handedly. Just as it's wrong for companies to think that their responsibility ends at their front door or on their bottom line, government has to do its part as well, with responsible social, fiscal policies that recognize the importance of human resources. Companies like StrideRight can and do make a difference. The daycare centers in Roxbury and Cambridge have made an enormous difference, I'm sure, in the lives of children, their families, and now those that have been out for 20 years, their new families, and the communities in which they live. But we, StrideRight, can't help all of the kids in Roxbury or Boston or Massachusetts or the United States. Business and government together must think of people as a national resource to be cultivated and developed. It's not in our interest to save taxes and have the next generation of workers uneducated and unhealthy. Tax incentives or capital gains tax cuts will not stimulate business, but a highly skilled, motivated workforce will. We must begin to think more about our long-term interests and how best to serve them. I believe that we will see more clearly how our corporate well-being and our community well-being communities converge. This unique institution, the American corporation, despite the abuses heaped upon it in the 80s, is capable of turning around. And as our values begin to inform our decision-making more often in the future, the private sector can become a vital political and moral force in this nation, and in a more enlightened partnership with the government, help restore the vitality of this economy. Business schools can respond by expanding the reach and vision of tomorrow's corporate leadership. They can even learn from the Kennedy School. We must build once again on our Jeffersonian heritage and focus on social justice rather than the anti-government policies of our recent presidents. Those policies have only served to promote the ills that are now undermining this democracy, this economy, and our dignity. Thomas Jefferson would have been, I think, an enlightened capitalist, not some trickle-down economist, promoting the well-being of our children and citizens who eventually become our consumers and our employees. It will not be easy to achieve this Jeffersonian vision. It'll take leadership, commitment, time, energy, and above all, vision. But underlying this commitment will be the conviction that family and the workplace, or corporate and social responsibility, can no longer be separated, and that one enhances the other. So again, I thank you, Mr. Dively, and your family for thinking of this kind of recognition, and particularly for being one of the recipients. Thank you.
Thank you both for superb presentations. We can take some questions from the floor. The easiest way to do this so that people can hear you, there's a microphone here and one there. But if people are shy to get to them, let me start with the first one that I'm sure is on some people's mind, although it always falls somehow to someone from the School of Government rather than the School of Business to ask, how much does this cost? And so we might start with, because and by the way, in posing that, I should say that we all understand that you can't simply take the cost of the activity as it shows on the books and say that's the costs and benefits of the activity. But for example, if you were to compare the cost of training a worker by this method as opposed to what the cost might be, I don't know the labor market in Wichita, to get somebody of comparable skills, what, if any, premium are you paying, and do you feel you're getting economic benefit for the premium?
There is so much difference between a standard sheet metal training course, which we have operated for years and years because we require a certain amount of mathematical skill and coordination to do that, that I would hesitate to give you an exact answer other than to say it's probably 4 or 5 times greater in training the employees at the 21st Street Center. There is very little economic benefit to us initially, but we feel so strongly in the investment long range that the economics were never really a consideration.
Turn here. Is there a question here?
Mr. Meyer, for quite a long time, Cessna Aircraft Corporation was the leader in light aircraft with the Cessna 150, 152, 172. Do you see Cessna ever returning to the light aircraft business with airplanes comparable to those?
I think everybody at Cessna would be so pleased to be back in the we had about 65% of the world's piston engine aircraft production for about 20 years. And our industry used to build routinely 15,000 to 18,000 airplanes a year until the early 1980s. And the product liability costs are so staggering, they are hundreds of times greater than they were 15 years ago, that there is today not a single aircraft manufacturer in this country, with the exception of 2 or 3 that make a handful of airplanes. We will deliver in this industry less than 500 piston-powered airplanes compared to 18,000. And I will not get on the soapbox too high tonight, but it is terribly frustrating to realize that this country has lost its worldwide leadership in an aviation industry which is high technology. We estimate a minimum of 50 to 70,000 jobs have been lost in just the last 5 to 7 years because of a product liability environment which is so unrealistic as to be hard to describe. We are in the industry being held responsible for the life of the product, and in many cases, as you would expect and hope, an airplane lasts a long time. And operated properly, there's no reason not to fly a 50 or 60-year-old airplane. The average age of an airplane in this country today is 28 years. The airlines get terribly concerned when they get an average of 15 or 18 or 20, and there's nothing wrong with a 40 or 50-year-old airplane. The problem is that unskilled pilots with occasionally poor judgment tend to operate older airplanes that are not maintained as properly as new airplanes. And the fact is that even though we've enjoyed 15 consecutive years of improved safety in our industry, that any time there's an accident, there is normally a lawsuit. And that's why the cost of product liability is so high. We will not be back in that business until there is some way to realistically and economically, actuarially justify it.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Mr. Meyer, your proposal to pay for the training of people of Wichita, and as long as they're guaranteed jobs with other firms, I'm wondering, although it's very generous, I'm wondering what kind of economic or business sense that makes as far as the return on your investment, or how you'll justify it to your stockholders or so forth, that you'd be paying for training for other firms that they don't have to make that investment.
Well, I'll tell you, after we've made the initial investment, the facility is large enough to handle at least twice as many trainees as we have today, and we're only working a daytime shift. There would be no problem. In fact, it would probably be easier for a lot of our folks to train at night. What we've offered to the other aircraft manufacturers in Wichita, and I'm happy to say that 2 of them have already agreed, is that we'll operate the facility, we will recruit the candidates, we will train them up to and including their ability to perform as a sheet metal assembler or whatever their skills may be. And at that point, we want the commitment that they will have a full-time job and that they will receive the kind of support that we give our trainees, because that's really when they're in the training facility, they're all in the same, they're kind of all in the same boat. There's a lot of rapport and enthusiasm and morale, and it's a big step to go from a training facility which is in their neighborhood and has 50 or 60 people to go to a facility where there's 4,000 or 5,000 employees in a big parking lot and half of them don't have automobiles when they come and so forth. And we want to be sure that we have that commitment from the other companies. Economically, it seems to us that that's a good investment for the community, and we're prepared to do that.
Questions? Would you like to address this general cost question?
It's estimated by the National Conference Board that to train a new worker, to bring that worker up to a level of productivity as the departing worker, generally is about $21,000 a year. If you consider your investments in retaining people, if your programs like Russ's and StrideRight's tends to stabilize a workforce, you can make a pretty good case for not just attracting good people, and you tend to have a much better opportunity to attract better people, but then they have a vested interest in staying, and it's not just a matter of salary. So we feel, as you do, that you do recover your investments pretty quickly.
Yes, sir.
In his writings and oral presentations, Peter Drucker generally thinks that the business of business should be business, and in fact that the time and the financial resources of management and private companies should not be particularly involved in social engineering for two respects. One is it withdraws resources, both financial and management, from the company's primary purpose, which is to compete in a competitive world. And second of all, that the power that private companies have to exercise social control in an undemocratic manner leads to possible abuses, or could lead to possible abuse or misabuse. I wondered if each of you could comment.
Well, don't look at me.
I a lot of respect for Mr. Drucker, but I think maybe he belongs to another era, or he hasn't really looked at some of the current data. I didn't mention our financial performance to sell stock here tonight. I merely wanted to point out that the StrideRight Corporation this year, for example, gave 5% of its pre-tax earnings, 5% of its pre-tax earnings to the foundation that supports these social initiatives. That has not deterred the company from experiencing a compounded growth rate of over 30% in earnings per share for the last 5.5 years. So, I fail to see that there is a dilution of performance to the stockholders, or a distraction on the part of management from its being in the business of business. I think you can make an even better case that if you take a little broader view of what your responsibilities are, your commitment to stockholders can be enhanced. And until our earnings fall out of bed, we're kind of resting our case.
Well, I guess I'd only add that I hadn't read that, but I think maybe too many people have. And I think it's unfortunate that more companies do not participate in activities which are truly constructive and beneficial outside the, obviously we spend most of our time and effort running the business, but there's certainly a great deal more than that in anyone's career and anyone's life.
Right here.
Yes, I'd like to build on that, on your responses to that question, and ask sort of a two-part question. First, what is it going to take to move a majority of companies towards taking these kinds of actions that you are taking to address social problems in their communities? And secondly, I'm interested to know what kinds of steps you are both taking to share the program models that you've developed with other companies so that they can see this is something that's working that they could model programs on.
I'll answer that Arnold, quickly, and then you can add some comments. I think the good news is that a greatly increasing number of companies are considering programs not necessarily exactly like ours or exactly like Stride Rights, but programs that are beneficial to the community, either the children or GE won this award last year for a nationwide mentoring program with high school students, which is a wonderful program that has spread to a lot of other areas, a lot of other companies. We were not really criticized when we started this program, but John Moore, who is here with me, and I had lots of questions that this would never work and why are you spending your time doing this. And we've been not only gratified with the success of the program, but in the last several months, John has met with all of the major companies in Wichita. As I said, we already have commitments from 2. I'd be very surprised if we don't have commitments from many more. And other companies are looking at similar kinds of programs. So I think there's a much greater awareness today than there might have been 5 or 10 years ago. I think that's tremendously healthy and certainly essential to this country.
Well, I can't add much to what has been said, except to say that particularly when employment was much higher, more and more companies, in competing for a labor pool, decided that it was in their best interests to address some of the needs of their employees. So child care then became an issue and was more readily adopted. But I don't think you can wait for an upturn in employment again, and that's why I think ultimately, just to confuse everybody, the business of preschool education, I think, ultimately belongs in the hands of a responsible government who can recognize that those kind of investments are good for everyone, and that you can't leave it to the random interest of a company, particularly in a downturn, because people get tempted to cut expenses, and that becomes an obvious kind of expense reduction. But I do think we can set examples, and I do think that we can encourage our colleagues, and we do. But I think a lot of leadership has to come from Washington. It once did.
Right here.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to congratulate both of you and your companies for your accomplishments with these successful programs. And I hope it represents a change in the image and the activities of business in America. And my question is, in the past, some have proposed that the reluctance of business to get involved in social programs is partially due to their training in business schools, a curriculum that may be heavy on finance, economics, and accounting, and maybe light on ethics and the environment. First of all, do you agree with that proposition? And secondly, if so, would you advocate some changes in the curriculum of the business schools of today?
Well, as I indicated earlier, I think they should adopt some of the Kennedy School culture over there. My feeling is that that there has been that there is a great opportunity to be maybe a little less parochial and to recognize that businesses can do better. It's in their best interests. And leadership, particularly younger people coming up, I think are beginning to understand, those people that are concerned about the quality of life, that these kinds of investments make sense. And I think there is a lot more consideration being given to those issues. I know that John MacArthur has been given lots of money to teach ethics. Well, I'm not sure he's figured out how you teach ethics, but I know he's, for example, encouraging a public service program for the undergraduates. And as they get more involved in the community, I'm sure that leaves a kind of impression. So maybe it's outside the classroom as well as in the classroom that a lot of this kind of learning or broadening of their perspective will take place.
I'm probably not the right one to answer that question, since I didn't go to business school. I went to Harvard Law School, and I would be surprised if they were a whole lot more compassionate over there than they are in business school. But I would say this: I think the young people that we have hired that have gone to the business schools in recent years, it seems to me, and maybe it's just my age, or maybe it's the chain, maybe it's just a perspective, but I think there is a considerably more, not altruistic, but a more well-rounded, a more socially involved graduate today than there was 5 or 10 years ago when everybody was running to New York. And I think it's a very healthy sign, and one that I hope will continue.
This will be the final question right here.
Good evening, Mr. Hyatt. I'm from a small town in Missouri, Tipton, Missouri, and we have a Stride-Rite factory in our town. And since looking around the room, I don't see anyone else from my town. I might serve as the representative tonight. I would like to commend you on the award you're receiving tonight. It's a great program. And I would also like to say that our town is very grateful to your company. They have been an economic backbone of our town for many years. But I do wonder, as far as daycare programs, do you have plans to extend this into the smaller towns? I know people that I went to school with specifically, that are working for your company, and something like this would be a great benefit to them. I was wondering what type of programs or implementations or plans you have to bring this to the smaller rural settings.
Your treasurer is listening.
But I think the president of the Stride-Rite division is here also, who is responsible for that plant. And my impression is that we're doing a survey in Tipton right now, or it's maybe already been done, to determine need. We did it several years ago, and I believe our workers were of an age where the issue of preschool children didn't warrant that kind of investment. I think we're now looking at it, though, not just in terms of the plant itself, but the plant and the community. Am I right about that, Marcia?
Great. And I can quote you on that.
Shaking your head, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the witching hour. I guess what we've shown is that you can travel the journey to corporate responsibility either by foot, as at Stride-Rite, or by air, as at Cessna. But it's certainly a lot easier if you have a guide like Arnold Hyatt or a pilot like Russell Meyer. We're indebted to you both.